Hi class, it's Dr. T. This is to review the teaching strategies portfolio or toolbox in preparation for submission at the end of this coming week. As you know, the week 4 begins tomorrow on Wednesday and will end on next Tuesday, September 3rd. Your teaching strategies toolbox portfolio electronic version is due on September 3rd by midnight. And on September 4th, when we have the Teaching Strategies Fair, you will bring the completed hard copy of the portfolio for display at the fair, and I will also be taking them back with me to grade them as the original. So let's go over the teaching strategies portfolio to be sure you understand it and that you're all set and ready to go forward. Okay, so here we are with the guideline for the Teaching Toolbox portfolio. As you know, let's go over this. It's going to have 8 tabs in it. It's in a 3-ring binder, and you have these 8 different sections, 1 through 8. I'm sorry to see it says 7 sections up here, but here it is really 8 sections. Number 8 are the references. So make sure you have those 8 tabs in your portfolio. Then you're going to have a cover page, and your cover page would be exactly like this, the teaching portfolio of put your name in here, put a picture over here, and then this is what it's to say. Down at the bottom of this front page, you would have a quote that you chose and cite the source of the quote. And I would assume the quote is going to be about education. Then we go to part 1. Here's your philosophy of teaching. This is what you've already created. Certainly feel free to modify, enrich, or whatever you feel like you need to do to make it more reflective of where you are now. I know you developed your teaching philosophy early on in the program, so you might want to take a look at it. But that's where your teaching philosophy would go. Be sure it is not a teaching philosophy specific to a course, but it is your general teaching philosophy. As you apply for teaching positions in academia, they will ask you about your teaching philosophy and will usually want to actually see it in writing. Part 2 is pretty simple. You put under part 2 are your educator reflections. These are the reflections you've been doing throughout the last 3 or 4 weeks. You'll have the 4 you've completed, and then after the Teaching Strategies Fair, you will post to me in the Dropbox your 5th and final reflection. So part 1 and part 2 are quite self-explanatory and pretty straightforward. Now we go on to your first challenge. That's part 3. This is where you address a core concept. And that core concept has been assigned to you. So make sure that the core concept is the one that you were assigned. So for example, Jennifer, you have clinical judgment and clinical wisdom. Chisa, you have population-based care. Deborah, you have evidence-based practice, and so on. So look at your list and be sure you understand what your global concept is. Under this tab, then, you would have an overview and definition of your concept. And as you know and you learned in curriculum, this would be the conceptual thread that would be integrated throughout the curriculum. The overview that you develop should provide a good, clear understanding of the concept and especially justify why it should be a core clinical skill or understanding or knowledge-based competency that should be taught and learned. Please discuss how the achievement of competencies in your area would lead to improved health outcomes and health care quality. Also, be sure you cite credible sources. So that's your first page for this. Then you would go and identify the competencies that would demonstrate the achievement of this skill. you would correlate these competencies with the levels of nursing education. So if you picked a 4-year program, then you would identify a level of competency for each year of the program. If you picked an associate's degree program, you would identify levels of competencies for each semester. In each case, you would have 4 broadly defined competencies. For each competency, you'd have 2 measurable learner objectives. So there's 4 competencies, 1 for each year or semester, depending on whether it's BSN or AD, and then you would have 2 measurable learner objectives for each competency that you identified. Then you would have 2 teaching strategies for each competency for each level of nursing education that you identified. This would help you to demonstrate that the concept was being integrated within the entire program. Obviously, if you measure the 2 measurable learner objectives, it would make sense that your teaching strategies would correlate with those learner objectives. So you're going to have 4 competencies identified, 1 for each year or 1 for each semester of the AD program. You're going to have 2 learner objectives for each competency. So there's 4 competencies with 2 learner objectives. That's 8 total learner objectives. And obviously then you would have 8 teaching strategies identified for each learner objective. So you'd have 8 teaching strategies plans, interactive teaching plans, 1 for each objective that you identified. And you would organize according to using this outline. So you'd have the competency, you'd identify the objective, the learner objective. So the learner objective would be a practitioner who, and then identify that, and then what the teaching strategies are. Then you would have an interactive learning plan for each teaching learning strategy that you identified, which clearly would be 8 different teaching strategies for the 8 objectives. Hope that makes sense to you, and do take a look at the example that I provided. Then you move on to part 4. This is what you've all picked for your clinical health focus. This is pretty simple, class. All you need to do is go over the topic that you chose. So you would have a brief description of an overview and definition of your clinical health focus. Justify why the focus you chose is important to nursing education. And then you'd identify 4 learner objectives and teaching strategies that you think would be useful and meaningful in teaching some areas of content related to this particular clinical focus. So you'd have an interactive learning plan for each teaching learning strategy that you identified, which would be 4. Then that's it for that section. Then you would go on to your course development paper. You're going to put your paper under this section. Then you want to identify the specific learner objectives and strategies you plan on utilizing for 2 of the 4 classes you developed. You're going to complete an interactive learning plan for each one of those strategies, keeping in mind that all objectives must be addressed. You also must address both classroom learning and clinical learning. I know that was a requirement of your module, so I'm sure you have learning objectives identified for both the didactic and for the clinical area. So you must have a minimum of 4 interactive learning plans. However, you must address all learner objectives and teaching strategies that you identified. Now, I do not have any problem with you returning to that class, and if you felt at the time you developed that class you were unrealistic about how many learner objectives you could have for teaching a 1-hour or 2-hour or 3-hour class, then certainly feel free to modify and reduce those learning objectives or learner objectives to a reasonable number that would be possible to actually address in your unit of instruction. So that's your course development paper. Then part 6 would be your teaching learning plan. That's pretty simple. You've completed that. All you have to do is put it in here. And then your last section is the Evaluation Strategies Showcase. This is an area students frequently lose points, so be careful and listen to me and be sure that you follow what I'm saying. You are going to create 4 different strategies. You are relating these evaluation strategies specifically to the learning objectives you identified in your course development paper. So you're going to create a table. Here's your table. It's very simple. Identify the strategy, strategy 1, 2, 3, and 4. What objective is it going to measure? So if you had an objective relating to understanding content and you said you were going to provide a test, then you would have put that down, or let's say it was a quiz. You'd identify whether the strategy was formative or summative. And I will remind you that in general, formative assessments do not carry points. In other words, the student does not get graded on a formative assessment. It's supposed to help the student move forward, not be a final number. So if it's formative, it likely is not graded. And then what level of learning are you measuring according to Bloom's taxonomy? Then you'd have strategy 2, 3, and 4. Now you have this, don't stop there. Then you must provide a sample of each of the evaluation strategies that was created in order to measure that learning objective. So if you said you have a quiz, then put the quiz there. If you said you want the students to develop and write a paper, then you would put the grading rubric for the paper there. If you said the students were responding to specific discussion questions, you'd put the 2 discussion questions or 1 or whatever there. Or if it was a group team activity, you would put what it was and how you were actually measuring it. Remember, this is your measurement section, so there has to be some kind of paper example of what your measurement strategy is. It could be a grading rubric, could be a quiz, it could be a description of how you would evaluate class discussions and student learning in the class discussion. It could be a paper the student write, whatever. You would identify whether it was formative or summative and relate it to the learner-centered objectives that you identified. Then your final part of this portfolio is the references. You only have 1 section with references. So any references you have from your paper or from any other portion of this portfolio would be in this section. You do not have a reference list anywhere else in the portfolio. That's it. And other than that, you want to be sure that your portfolio is professional looking. It is clean and neat, doesn't look messy. This is a portfolio that you want to be proud to share with others. Don't dress it up with crafts or little engaging material in it, because this is really meant to be a professional portfolio that you would bring to an interview. Certainly you can put graphics in it that are professional in appearance. The appearance of your portfolio absolutely matters. It matters to me, and it will matter to anybody who interviews you. So that's it for the portfolio. That's how it should look. That's the content. Please let me have any questions. As I said, you can call me, you can Skype me, or you can post to the Ask the Professor. The portfolio is due 1 week from today. Today is Tuesday, August 27th, so it's due next Tuesday, September 3rd by 12 midnight. You're going to submit the electronic version, and then you're going to bring to class the completed, professional, and outstandingly awesome portfolio.